In the autumn of 1931, a massive radio signal tearing across the North American night sky at 500,000 watts began peddling unregulated medical cures and snake oil to the masses. The voice on the microphone belonged to Dr. John R. Brinkley, a disgraced physician who had recently been stripped of his medical license in Kansas for implanting goat testicles into human patients. Yet U.S. federal agents were entirely powerless to take his broadcast off the air. His colossal radio tower sat just inches across the international border in Mexico, shielding him behind the Rio Grande. Brinkley hadn't chosen this brutal, remote stretch of the Chihuahuan Desert by accident. He was drawn by a geographic freak of nature, the San Felipe Springs, which pump 90 million gallons of pure water out of a dry limestone fault line every single day. That massive oasis in the middle of extreme isolation created a jurisdictional vacuum. It acted as a powerful magnet for ambitious men seeking to build wealth entirely outside the reach of American society. A guaranteed daily water supply is the only way to conquer a desert. In 1882, the Southern Pacific Railroad carved its tracks straight to the springs, establishing a vital transcontinental lifeline through the punishing Trans-Pecos terrain. With direct rail access to eastern textile mills, local ranchers began aggressively farming Angora goats in the arid scrubland. Almost overnight, this remote frontier outpost transformed into the largest inland wool and mohair port in the United States, generating sudden, massive wealth. A flood of new capital far removed from formal oversight breeds rogue authority. Men stepped into the vacuum to bend the law to their own will, perfectly embodied by saloon-keeper Judge Roy Bean, who declared himself the sole source of justice in the territory. Decades later, Dr. Brinkley arrived as the ultimate evolution of this frontier exploitation. Facing criminal charges and the loss of his practice up north, he simply packed up his fortune and moved his operation to the edge of the map. The border's physical isolation provided an impenetrable barrier. For men with enough money and influence, the boundary line offered a place to build empires, completely insulated from regulation or consequence. Brinkley weaponized that international boundary by constructing his station, XRA, on Mexican soil. The newly formed U.S. Federal Radio Commission could police the American airwaves, but they had absolutely no jurisdiction over a transmitter in Coahuila. Unburdened by wattage limits, XRA blasted at levels that turned barbed wire fences into makeshift antennas. Brinkley commanded an entirely unregulated media platform, reaching audiences from Texas to Canada, who previously had no access to national broadcasts. To fill the airtime between his medical pitches, Brinkley hired live performers. Through these unregulated broadcasts, early hillbilly, gospel, and country acts, including the pioneering Carter family, reached massive national audiences, creating the first widespread commercial market for rural American music. The border blaster era exposed a distinct paradox. International borders limit the authority of governments, but they infinitely expand the power of those wealthy enough to exploit the gap between them. That freedom to operate above the law did not extend to the people actually building the economy. Mexican-American laborers who laid the rail lines and worked the mohair ranches faced severe localized control. Del Rio authorities enforced a strict tripartite segregation system. While Anglo students attended well-funded facilities, Mexican descent children were physically confined to an inferior two-room brick building known as the West End School. Since Mexican Americans were technically classified as white, the district created a subcategory for linguistic deficiency, routing students into segregated classrooms. In 1930, parents led by Jesus Salvatierra sued, mounting the first state-level legal challenge against the educational segregation of Mexican Americans. They secured a temporary injunction, but the victory was short-lived. An appellate court eventually sided with the school district's language loophole, legally validating the practice of de facto segregation. When the law is manipulated by distance and local prejudice, it fails to protect its most vulnerable citizens, leaving them entirely on their own to survive. Realizing the Anglo-controlled system would continually use legal borders to lock them out, the Mexican-American community decided to draw jurisdictional lines of their own. Between 1929 and 1930, residents of the San Felipe neighborhood successfully petitioned the county to form an independent entity.
They built a solely autonomous, self-funded school district managed entirely by Mexican Americans. Inside those walls, the environment transformed. Parents managed administrative hiring, teachers instructed in Spanish, and community pride replaced systemic shame. The San Felipe Independent School District was a profound act of geopolitical defiance, the first time a Mexican-American community in Texas successfully wrested administrative power from the state to govern their own future. That era of highly localized control finally collided with federal intervention in 1971. A federal judge issued a sweeping mandate declaring the district's long-standing linguistic separation unconstitutional and ordering the immediate consolidation of the white and Mexican-American schools. The institutional lines that had divided the oasis for nearly a century were erased to create the San Felipe Del Rio Consolidated Independent School District. Del Rio operated as a societal laboratory. It tested how far wealthy predators could push the limits of the law in a jurisdictional void, and how much a marginalized population could withstand. The exact same extreme geographic isolation that allowed outsiders to exploit the system ultimately forged a community resilient enough to rewrite the rules.